my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats. Today I'm doing a video that is kind of a bookend to one I posted back in December. Back at the beginning of December, I did a series I want to continue video, which implies the existence of a series I'm not going to continue video, and then I made that list. I made both of these lists at the same time, and then I only filmed the first one. And because I know negativity sells, it's time to follow up. My basic rules I had for that last video apply here. I am looking at the past 3 years of reading going back through 2023. There are a bunch of series I'm not continuing where I last read an entry in that series before 2023, and that is just so long ago that it isn't worth dredging up those memories to try and remember what I thought about those books and why I haven't read their sequels. And same as that first video, I am only counting books that already have sequels released. There are more books in this series already out that I could read, so this list would be longer if I had all the books on it that I know are going to be getting sequels in the future that I don't plan on reading. But in the interests of both time and consistency with that first video, I am limiting this to books that have sequels already published. And then the one caveat that many of these have for me is that the one thing that could get me to keep reading some of these series is potential future Hugo nominations, either for the sequels individually or for the series as a whole in the series category. Where I think that's a real possibility, I will let you know. There are 2 series already that were on this list when I made it in December that I have pulled off of the list officially, even though I'm still going to talk about them. I've officially pulled them off the list because of this year's Hugo nominations. So I am actually going to start by talking about those 2 series, why I originally thought they were series I wasn't going to continue on with, and what my current plans for reading them for this year's Hugos are. The first is the Sworn Soldier series by T. Kingfisher. These are horror novellas. The first one is What Moves the Dead, the second is What Feasts at Night, and the third book, What Stalks the Deep, is the one that's nominated in the novella category this year. Now, I am a huge fan of T. Kingfisher's fantasy, and her fantasy does often have some surprisingly horrific elements that pop up in it. That's sort of one of her trademarks as an author. And while I'm typically fine with the amount of horror that shows up in her fantasy, my feeling since she started publishing adult horror novels, and subsequently these horror novellas, was that her actual genre horror, I was just not going to read. That was gonna be a pass for me. Like, the amount of horror that's in her fantasy is kind of my threshold. I don't really want more than that from her. And I stuck to that the year that What Moves the Dead was nominated for a Hugo Award. I did not read it in 2023. But then What Feasts at Night was nominated last year, and I did read both of them then because I was reading the whole novella category last year. And I gave them both 3 stars, for kind of different reasons. The first book had some, like, just deeply disturbing yikes moments of the sort that are the reason I decided I would not be reading T. Kingfisher's horror to begin with. That one was a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher. I don't believe either of the sequels are retellings of anything. They are set in an alternate history, I think 19th century, question mark? It has to be alternate history because the protagonist is from a fictional European country that doesn't exist, and so the author gets to make up their entire history. The second book just felt kind of weak to me in comparison to the first, both in terms of just being not as good a book, not packing as much of a punch. So that was the downside, but the plus side for me is that the horror was not nearly as scary. These are fairly mildly speculative, just not really my cup of tea all around. The one thing I really like about them, though, like the one thing that I will say makes me a fan of this series to the extent that I am, which is not very much, is that I think the protagonist, Alex Easton, is great. They're a veteran who's been through a terrible war and has been really shaped by that experience. And they are a character who really stands out to me in the lineup of T. Kingfisher protagonists. Like, she often has a type or a set of types of characters that she writes, and sometimes her protagonists blend into each other a bit for me. We'll see what I think about book 3. Honestly, I'm expecting another 3-star read, and I'm expecting it to be near the bottom of my Hugo ballot for the novella category, but, you know, these books aren't that long. I can read it. And then the other series that's gotten pulled off of my not continuing with it list is the Legendborn cycle by Tracy Deonn. I think each of the books in this series, and there are 3 of them now, have been nominated for the Lodestar Award, which is the YA award at the Hugos. And I have failed to read them in a timely manner for voting. Legendborn was nominated in 2021, and I did not get to most of the Lodestar list that year. Bloodmarked was nominated in 2023, and that's when I went back and actually read Legendborn. I gave it 3 stars and then didn't read Bloodmarked in time for voting. And thought, well, I guess that's it. I'm not continuing with this series. And then this year, Oathbound is nominated. And so, hey, I'm reading Bloodmarked. I've read chapter 1 and everything. It's happening. I feel like this is going to be controversial of me to say why I didn't love Legendborn. Because I do see what's so good about it. This is about a Black American girl whose mother has recently died. And she's high school aged, I'm pretty sure, but she's going to like this early college program on a college campus that her mother did not want her to go to. And she gets entangled with this magic, secret Arthurian society that's like preparing for the great war against the forces of evil or something. I'm not remembering the details. And she's basically trying to infiltrate this secret society, and to do that she has to do their magic trials. And the whole point here is that this is a very traditionally white institution and that she's a fish out of water. There's a point, like, fairly late in the book where she finally starts learning about her mother's magic. And that was when it started to get really interesting for me. And then the first book has a great ending. Ending is a banger. But this is not a short book. This is fairly long, and it spends a huge chunk of the book with these, I thought, fairly pointless magic trials. Like, one of my biggest fantasy pet peeves is magic trials where there is no need for magic trials to exist. Like, there has to be some sort of weird hoops she has to jump through to get admitted to the Magic Society, and then she'll have to do some amount of, like, specialized training. But there is this whole formal rigmarole around the fantasy trope of a magic trials book, and I felt there was no need for this to be a magic trials book in that particular way. The trials themselves were uninteresting to me, and then inevitably stuff starts going wrong with the trials for plot reasons, and the adults don't, like, put a stop to this. Like, this isn't Hunger Games sort of trials where you're trying to kill the teenagers. Like, you want all the teenagers to survive these trials. So you would think when things start going horrifically wrong, you might say, halt the trials, we'll do admission some other way. It seemed to me, and I must emphasize, I know absolutely nothing about the creative process behind this book. I know very little about the author. I don't know anything about her agent or her editors. It felt to me like the author had a great idea for a debut novel, and then at some point in the process someone told her, you're going to need to make this a magic trials book to sell it. But the trials are all over by the end of the first book. It had, like, a mind-blowingly cool ending, and I would have absolutely been ready to go on to book 2, except that around that time I'd been hearing everyone saying that book 2 wasn't as good as book 1, and I had just given book 1 3 stars. So, But now that book 3 is out, I've heard glowingly positive things about book 3. So I'm back in. But I will tell you, one chapter in, it's already painfully obvious to me that I do not remember things, so we'll see how this goes. So now that we've taken way too much time with the 2 series that aren't actually on this list anymore, I'm going through these from most recently read a book in the series to least recently read a book in this series, going back through 2023. So my most recently read series on this list is East by Edith Pattou, which did not have a sequel for many, many years, but now it does. I read this book in December last year. I had owned this copy for years. This was published in 2003. It's a YA East of the Sun, West of the Moon retelling, and I gave it 3 stars. If, like me, you are trying to read all of the best-known fairy tale retellings that you missed out on growing up, this is fine. I mean, that's why I picked it up. I'm glad I did. I'm glad I've checked it off the list. As an adult reader in 2026, I don't think this holds up particularly well. There's a lot that feels like kind of naive or maybe shallowly researched about this. And I am not speaking as any sort of expert in the subjects of textile making or Arctic travel, just to name two subject matters that appear in this book. But there was just a sense to me that, like, none of these subjects are treated with the amount of depth or seriousness that I would like to see. This kind of feels to me like an early work from an inexperienced author, except that she hasn't actually published much since then, until 2018, when this book randomly got a sequel called West. And the reviews for this second book were pretty bad. People didn't like it. And part of what is baffling to me reading this book in a world after the publication of the sequel is getting to the end and seeing that this book really leaves no opening for a sequel whatsoever. It has one of the types of endings where it's like, and here is how Rose spent the rest of her happy, normal, boring life. And for a sequel to happen, I think you have to actively retcon some of that ending. But it happened, and apparently the fans of the first book didn't like it, so I'm not gonna read it. Okay, the next series on this list is one that kind of pains me a little because I liked the first book and then I was disappointed in the second. This is the Miss Percy's Guide series. The first book is Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons. The second book is Miss Percy's Travel Guide to Welsh Moors and Feral Dragons. I read the first one in January of 2025 and the second one in November. And this is a self-published series that's a completed trilogy. I would only have to read one more book to finish it, but last time I checked, my library doesn't have that one book. I think I bought an ebook of the first book and then got the second book from the library. So my library would have to acquire the third book for me to even consider reading it at this point, and then I was disappointed in book 2. The first book I was charmed by, though. It's about like a 40-year-old spinster who is living with her sister and her sister's family and children, and she's essentially ended up spending her life as an unpaid governess for her sister's children. And then her great uncle dies and leaves her a box of stuff, including a very interesting stone that ends up being a dragon's egg, and the dragon hatches. And this is 19th century, more or less our world. No one thinks dragons are real, and so she is hiding this whole existence of the dragon from her sister, and she ends up kind of in cahoots with the local vicar and his housekeeper about it. And I thought the first book was charming. The villain plot in this was unexpected enough to be enjoyable, but I particularly appreciated the focus on the protagonist's like dysfunctional relationship with her sister, who is abusive and manipulative. and how she spends the whole book coming to terms with that and deciding to do something about it and make a change in her life. And I think this is maybe a little overwritten at times. There's some, a lot of sort of narrative asides that the author likes to do that aren't despite the title, the book itself isn't meant to be the pocket guide that Miss Percy has written. So like the narrator voice is like a narrator character in this, not the voice of the protagonist. And so the choice to do all of these narrative asides sometimes felt like a little much. Like maybe if this were a little more heavily edited, that could have been pared down some without losing too much. But it's an indie title and I give it some leeway, and I really didn't mind in book one. Book two ended up being a slog for me without ever being actively bad. This is just sort of the road trip book where we're going from point A to point B with a young dragon and things go predictably wrong along the way. And to me, this felt too long and too slow for what it was. I felt like every plot point up until like very near the end was extremely predictable. I felt like I knew exactly what was going to happen next, and then it did happen next. And this is where all of those extra narrative asides felt like they were slowing me down even more, and I took a really long time making it through book two, and this is not the sort of book that should take you that long to read. So I wouldn't dissuade anyone who likes the sound of book one from giving the series a try. I personally am probably never going to read book three though. Okay, moving on. The next series is one where I think I'm going to make enemies because this is a very beloved author. But I read and did not like The Magpie Lord by K.J. Charles, which is the first book in the A Charm of Magpies series, which is historical fantasy romance. And I read it in September of 2025. This was published in 2013. She's written a whole ton of other queer romance after this series, most of which is not fantasy, which is why I haven't read any of it. Because you can try to get me interested enough in a romance novel with no speculative elements to get me to pick it up, but you will probably fail. Here's the thing, I gave this 3 stars, and I think that was generous of me. I was generous to this book because it wasn't a slog. I read it fairly quickly. At no point did I even consider DNFing it. But I didn't come away from this thinking that the fantasy, the history, or the romance in this, any of them were particularly well done. Like, I know the historical setting of this was 19th century, but there was so little actual detail that would help someone pin down the historical context. The magic plot, our first guy is suffering from some sort of a curse, and he needs the second guy who knows magic to, like, investigate his nefarious family history and figure out what's behind the curse. I feel like I've seen this done better, and we'll get to that later. The romance I did not like, and this is one of those romance series where it's following one couple the whole series long. We are not switching and getting new couples with every book, and I don't want to keep reading about these two, sorry. I didn't like how the questions of consent that come up as a sort of central plot point of the book end up being handled here. The backstory of one of the main characters is that he was like shipped away to China when he was young and has come back after years abroad, and like I was skeptical of how China was discussed as like this mystical land where more people practice magic as part of everyday life, and also there is no homophobia. I don't actually have very much real historical knowledge about 19th century China, but that sort of dinged like an Orientalism alert in my brain. Here's the thing that I want to come back around to, though, is I think this is a series that has been influential for other writers who have written queer historical fantasy romance since then. I am specifically thinking about Freya Marsk's Last Binding trilogy here, because I cannot imagine, having read this book, that Freya Marsk didn't also read it before writing her books. And this is one of those situations where I feel like the derivative books that I read first were better. And I often have to remind myself that just because a book has maybe been influential in a niche genre or subgenre, it doesn't mean that it did the thing better than the books that came after. Sometimes the books that come after are building upon. Everything I've talked about in this video so far has been books that I haven't really discussed on this channel before, but some of these are books that I have discussed elsewhere, so I'm gonna run through them quickly and sort of direct you to other videos for my more detailed wrap-up and review-ish thoughts. One of those is the Fallen Gods trilogy by Hannah Kaner. I read God Killer in June of 2025. I have a full review of it on my channel. This was one that I did read for the Astounding Award. She was nominated for that, and I thought I might get around to the second book as well during that Hugo reading period, and I did not. And I had thought, well, definitely if the trilogy ends up nominated for Best Series this year, I'll read the rest of the trilogy, but it didn't. And I enjoyed this first book. It was fine. I particularly think the cover art of these books is fabulous. I know that's a little beside the point, but this is one where I really wouldn't object to continuing to read this series. I just feel like it's never going to be enough of a priority. There are too many books and too little time. Moving on to a book I read in March of 2025, So Let Them Burn by Kamilah Cole is the first book in the Divine Traitors duology. It is only 2 books. I'd only have to read the second book and I'd be done. Again, I just feel like I'm never going to feel compelled to. This was a YA fantasy debut that I don't think there's anything wrong with this for a teen audience, and I'm decidedly not a teenager, and the older I get, the harder and harder it is for me to enjoy books that do a lot of things that are really common storytelling conventions in YA that I've just seen too many times and sometimes I'm just too jaded to believe in. Kamilah Cole is nominated for the Astounding Award this year, so I could have pulled this one from this list and made it a series I will continue because of the Astounding nomination. And the reason I'm not doing that, in part, is just because the second book isn't in the Hugo voter packet. I'd have to go out of my way to get it. Also, the Astounding Award is, it's an award for Best New Writer, not for a specific book. And so I sort of feel like I can vote in that category with good conscience, even if I've only read one thing by an author. And to be honest, I remember so little about the actual plot and setup and characters of this. I don't think I'm even gonna try to give you like a little summary. But the things that felt like really YA about it that I just felt too old for, there are so few real adulty adults in this book. There's so much politics, and it's so many very young people who are supposedly running the country without like older, wiser advisors anywhere to be seen. The one like really adulty adult who gets a lot of page time in this book is the villain. He is supposedly, I think, the head of state of the colonizer nation, and why, as the head of state of a major global power, are you spending so much of your time personally running around villainizing teenagers? Don't you have a government to run? There are 2 main protagonists. One of the 2 characters goes away to the Dragon Riding Academy in the colonizer country, where remarkably little actual school seems to be happening at this school. And then finally, each of the 2 main characters ends up like paired up with another supporting character, and each of these relationships is inevitably going to turn romancy. But hey, one of the two relationships is sapphic, so it's not exactly like every other YA book I've read that does this. So that's my list of YA trope grievances about this book that will not matter to the actual intended audience of teenagers, of which I'm not one. Moving on to another book and series that I have talked about before, the Sandsea Trilogy by Chelsea Abdullah. I read The Stardust Thief in December of 2024. I've talked about it in a couple videos on this channel. I unhauled it in my most recent unhaul video. I thought this book was just too generic a fantasy series starter for me to be invested in continuing the series. Too many books, too little time. Okay, next is the Dreamhealers series by M.C.A. Hogarth. This is indie self-pub science fiction. I read the first book, Mind Touch, in August of 2024, and this is one I've talked about before. I talked about it in one of my book freakout tag videos. It was my most disappointing book for that part of that year, and it wasn't terrible. I gave this 3 stars. This is cozy, light academia, sci-fi, which, like, God, I wanted that combination to work so bad. And I felt like it just wasn't well enough written to get me really invested. I wanted this to give me so many warm, fuzzy feels, and it just left me cold. It's about these two characters who are in this, like, sci-fi interplanetary grad school program together. One of them's like a space elf. The other one is this animal hybrid person. It's a friendship story, not a romance. It takes place over a pretty long period of time, like maybe 2 years, and it's a long book, and I felt like it dragged. Okay, next is the only series that I've had to add to this list since I originally made this list at the end of last year, because, not because I read the first book in another series, but because this book had a sequel published. So now there's a second book, and I think I'm probably not gonna read it. This one, okay, my mind is maybe in the process of being changed on this by the reviews I'm seeing, because this book is very newly released. This is the Amina al-Sirafi series, starting with The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. The first book was nominated for a Hugo. I read it. I liked it. I gave it 4 stars, but I found it to be not the type of book that was gonna, like, stick with me long enough for me to still care by the time a sequel came out, which I think is true. I think it hasn't really stuck with me. And B, I remember the setup, the plot setup that happens for the sequels in this felt fairly forced, and, like, I didn't really need to know where that was going to lead. I was kind of fine with where book 1 ended. But now the second book, The Tapestry of Fate, is out, and I've heard a couple reviews that have piqued my interest. So I don't know. I could be swayed on this one. The first book was a Hugo nominee, so there's a possibility that book 2 also gets nominated for a Hugo next year, in which case this gets pulled off the will not read list and I will read it. There's also a possibility that it doesn't, but then the series makes best series at some later time when there's a third book. So I think maybe this is a series that I'm leaving to the Hugo nomination fates as to whether or not I will continue reading it or not. But I could be swayed. Okay, next, the Clandestine Magic series by Colleen, Cowley. This is another indie self-published series. I read the first book, Subversive, in January 2024. This is another one that has made one of my book freakout tag videos as a most disappointing book of that 6-month period. So I've talked about this before, and I really did not like this. This was 2 stars. This was a book that has been on a bunch of lists, recommendation lists for, like, fantasy of manners. It's kind of like actually an alternate fantasy contemporary America where, like, women's rights didn't happen, so everything still feels very 19th century. And God, I hated the romance in this. throw away the entire man. Okay, so there is some unfortunate disproportionate representation of indie books on this list. I will admit that. Because the next one I've got here is the Sparks and Philtres series by Tansy, Rayner, and Roberts. The first book was Gate Sinister. I read it in December of 2023. This is a novella series. I read this first novella on an airplane, and it made so little of an impression on me. It's a book where the protagonist is a governess with magical secrets and ulterior motives. And I had earlier that same year read The Path of Thorns by A.G. Slater, which is also a book where a governess has magical secrets and ulterior motives. And The Path of Thorns was just so much better. So not only did this book sort of suffer from comparison at the time, because I was reading it thinking, I recently read a book that did this better, but also my memories of it have been completely subsumed by my memories of the superior book through no fault of its own. I would consider reading more by Tansy, Rayner, Roberts, though. I do have the first book in her Teacup Magic trilogy on ebook. I might have more than the first book on ebook. And maybe those will be more my cup of tea, pun intended. Next, I'm gonna make everyone mad again, but if you've been following my channel, this won't surprise you at all because I've already unhauled this book, and it's Legends and Lattes. I read this in September of 2023 after it had been nominated for a Hugo Award in that year when all of the nomination stats were suspect. I've talked about my feelings on this book before. Basically, I said at the time I would read another book by Travis Baldree if he wrote something in a more interesting fantasy world. Because I found everything about the world building lazy and generic in this. And has he published anything in another fantasy world? No, he has not. He published a prequel to Legends and Lattes, and then he published like a sequel to the prequel, and I'm not reading them, sorry. Okay, next is a series where I do have physical books in the series, and I'm not getting rid of them. I'm not unhauling these. This is the Wayward Children series by Shannon Maguire. The first book is Every Heart a Doorway. The other ones I have are Down Among the Sticks and Bones, which is the second book, and In an Absent Dream, which is technically the fourth book, but it's a prequel. So I have a long ongoing history with these books. I read the first book when it was brand shiny new. And I was following the series for a while. My relationship with this series was always a little contentious though, because I didn't love book one. I gave this 3 stars. But I have since really enjoyed some of the books I've read in this series. I gave both of these 4 stars. I think they are my 2 favorite books in the series I've read. I've read all the way up to Where the Drowned Girls Go, which I read in September of 2023. Again, it was nominated for the Hugos in Best Novella, and that was, I think, the last year that one of these books was nominated in the novella category. For the record, my history on this series: Every Heart a Doorway, 3 stars. Down Among the Sticks and Bones, 4 stars. Beneath the Sugar Sky, I gave 4 stars at the time, mostly because I was, like, swept away by the whimsy of it all, and I love a good whimsy, but I honestly think that was probably, it should have only been a 3-star book for me if I'd been really honest with myself. In an Absent Dream, 4 stars. On its own, this might be my favorite of these books that I've read. Come Tumbling Down, Across the Greengrass Fields, and Where the Drowned Girls Go were all 3-star books for me, though. So at that point, I was only reading them because they kept getting Hugo nominated. I got to the point where the plotline I was invested in ended, and then they stopped getting nominated for Hugos. There's a chance I could read book 8. Book 8 is Lost in the Moment and Found, and that looks interesting enough to me. There are some things, though, that like 7 books in, I was getting frustrated with this series, how this series was handling in terms of like the portal fantasy themes overall. And I think I've just reached my stopping point with the series. Okay, Another bit of a Hugo Awards explainer for this next one, Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I read this first book, which is probably his most well-known book, in August of 2023, which was when this series was 3 books long and had been nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Series. I only made it through the first book. The second book was not readily available to me at the time, and I didn't feel like going out of my way to get my hands on a copy of that second book. Here's the thing, I liked Children of Time. I thought it was good, but with Adrian Tchaikovsky, he's so prolific, and the more of his books I read, because I keep reading them because they keep getting nominated for Hugo Awards, the less and less I like him as a writer and his sort of sets of recurring themes. The idea at this point that I would go out of my way to read a Tchaikovsky novel that I wasn't actively reading for that year's Hugo Awards, I just can't see myself doing it. I know there's a 4th book in this series that's just been published, and I suppose there's an off chance that could get nominated for Best Novel next year. So if that happened, I can see myself reading book 2. More likely, this isn't gonna end up on the Hugo shortlist again, but this book is fine as a standalone, and I liked it as a standalone. I gave it 4 stars. I have no desire to push myself to read more Tchaikovsky than I have to, because the more of him I read, the less I like. I'd rather just remember this as a good book. In case you don't know about this one, this is the one with the spider people. There is like a human spaceship with people in stasis fleeing Earth to this planet that they think will be inhabitable for them because there was an like uplift experiment that was supposed to have happened that will have made like intelligent monkey people on this planet, but it went wrong, and the intelligent people on this planet are intelligent spider people. And the best part of the book is the spiders half of the story, not the humans half of the story, where you get these sections of different protagonists from different eras of the spider planet's history. I am really not sure where this series goes from there, and I may never find out. Next is another book I unhauled in my most recent unhaul video, and that's Mortal Follies by Alexis Hall. This is a historical fantasy romance series that I could still be persuaded to library the second book, but it really isn't a priority for me. I gave this 3 stars. The first book was an FF romance. I think the second book is an MM romance. I don't know if there are going to be more books after book 2, but I read this first book in June of 2023. You guys, we are getting to books I read so long ago. I don't remember these books well enough to give you great detail, and they are for the most part books that I never wrapped up or reviewed. Sorry. But we've got some more YA that was just too much YA cliches for me. This is The Sunbearer Trials by Aidan Thomas. I read this in June of 2023. This is now a completed duology, and I am pretty sure I said somewhere on the internet at the time that if this had already had a published sequel at the time I read it, I would have gone straight on to reading the second book, and then I would have been done. But that if I had to wait a long time for that second book to be released, I was gonna lose interest. And behold, here we are. Celestial Monsters, the second book, was published more than a year after I read book 1, and I just never read it. You may have noticed this is another trials book, another YA trials book, and I gave it 3 stars. And you know, I genuinely loved the characters in this first book. I loved the friendships. I was even into the potential romance, but there was a lot here that didn't make sense to me. The world building was very like aesthetically, superficially cool. It's like this Mesoamerican contemporary-ish fantasy world, but the more you ask how this society is actually supposed to function, the less it makes sense. The same with the trials. The more you ask, why is trials how you're doing this? Why is teenagers who you're having do this? None of it makes sense. So in all likelihood, I am not going to read book 2. We are getting so close to the end here. I promise we are almost done. Only 2 more. The Book of Tea by Judy I is a duology that starts with a magic steeped in poison, which I read in May of 2023. This was, I think, already a completed duology at the time I read it, so I don't have the Sunbearer Trials excuse of like, yeah, I liked it, but I'm not willing to wait for book 2. Book 2 was available to me, and I dropped the ball and didn't read it. Apparently, I liked this book enough to give it 4 stars. It was kind of generic YA again, though. The generic YA-ishness of this didn't bother me a ton, which is why I think I rated it so highly. And I really thought I was going to read book 2 and have read a completed series, but then I waited too long and I forgot everything about book 1. I remember so little about this. That boat has extremely sailed. This author has published other things since then. I think she's published a couple standalones since then, which would be a better idea for me next time. And then lastly is the Midsolar Murders series by Mur Lafferty. The first book was Station Eternity, which I read in February of 2023. I know I've already unhauled this. I don't remember when. I think I talked about it some at the time. This series is now 3 books long, but given that I only rated book 1 2 stars, I was never even considering reading the sequels. This was very much described as if it was going to be a cozy sci-fi mystery series. And it was not cozy at all. This is, I think, actually a more ambitious science fiction project than it was maybe selling itself as. I didn't particularly like the science fiction project it was doing, though. It was quirky in a way that didn't work for me. There was a lot more violence and disaster and death than I thought I was signing up for. Did not enjoy. And whew, there you have it. I finally made it to the end of this video. Let me know, have you read any of these books? Have you made it further in any of these series than I have? Anyways, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.